Want to thank Melissa and everyone else who worked so hard to organize this event. My name is Dr. Adam Pine, and this is Dr. Rebeca De Souza. Rebecca's in the communications department at SDSU, and I'm in the geography department. Today, we're going to talk about food justice and the right to food and the historical and political context of hunger. We'll talk for about 50 minutes, and so there'll be time for questions afterwards. And now Rebecca's going to talk about the right.
I'm going to start off by talking about what we call right. What is the right to food? The right to food is inscribed in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it says that everyone has the right to a standard of living for themselves and their family, clothing, housing, and other basic needs. It also says that the right to food is not a right to be fed, but a right to feed oneself in dignity. So this is really important because right away you notice that this understanding doesn't include charitable means of eating, right, or feeding other people through charity. The right to food means that food must be available, accessible, and adequate to all. It means that a person needs land, seeds, water, and or resources to grow, or money to buy food in the marketplace. And who is responsible for securing the right to food? Well, according to the UN Charter, governments are responsible for securing a community's right to food. The reality is that food is the adequate, available, or accessible to a large number of people. Last 15 years, food insecurity in the U.S. has hovered between 12 and 15% of the population. 45 for this worry about where their next meal is from. This also means then that 45 million people are seeking out charitable sources to have their needs met. This is a gigantic proportion of the population. In California, there are also deep disparities in terms of food access. So while overall the food insecurity prevalence in California and San Diego are slightly lower than the national averages, we see that food insecurity prevalence in Imperial County, where we are here today, is almost double that of California and San Diego, and nearly 20% of the population. That's no small number. So now that we've talked a little bit about the right to food, right, this idea that food should be accessible, available, and adequate for everybody, I want to talk a little bit more about this. The right to food and food justice are two concepts that Adam and I use in our work, and it frames a lot of the work that we do. Then what is food justice? So food justice means ensuring that the benefit and the risk of where, what, and how food is grown and produced, transported, distributed, accessed, and eaten are shared fairly. Now, this is like a lot of big words in this one definition, but what it's basically saying is that at every stage or step of the food system, there has to be equity. And if you think about our food system in terms of this graphic, includes things like growing the food, and so basically food justice is saying the people who grow our food and the conditions that they work in, that has to also be equitable. It means there has to be equity in harvesting, there has to be equity in packing, in transporting, in retailing, in eating, and then something we don't often think about, also in disposing of food waste, because that's a big environmental issue that we know. There are people who work in that arena, and the food justice literature says we have to also be thinking about that. But of course, what we know is that there is injustice at every step. The three areas of the food system that Adam and I think a lot about in our work is the growing, retailing, and eating space. And we'll offer a few examples from these arenas in our presentation today. But for now, what's really important to know is that the similarity between the human rights approach, which I started off with, adequate, accessible, available, and the justice approach, they both emphasize the connection between food and structural inequity and other systems of inequity. So in other words, the right to food, right, is more than just food. It is connected to the right to a livable wage, it's connected to the right to housing, it's connected to the right to education. Because hunger is a symptom of all of these broader issues of economic inequities and racial inequities. And now, since I've given you sort of a brief conceptual framework for our talk, right to food and justice, Adam is going to talk about the causes of hunger.
How should we think about the root cause of hunger? And how should we think about the political and sort of cultural aspects of hunger? And this is important because we know that the land in Gaza and the land in Israel is the same land, yet there's hunger in Gaza. So we know that it's not about if the land is able to produce food that produces hunger, it's about something else. And that something else is why studying hunger and studying food insecurity is so difficult and so political, and in fact so painful, because it's about colonialism, it's about racism, it's about plantation, it's about all of the inequities that have produced our country. In our paper that we recently published in this edited collection, Rebeca and I discussed the right to food as a much needed framework for alleviating hunger and food insecurity in the US and connecting those ideas to food justice. At the core, when we talk about food justice and hunger, it means thinking about the right to food through a racial lens. So taking some of those broader ideas that Rebeca talked about and focusing them, picture, kind of focusing them onto race and how race plays into that. In the paper, we explore 6 specific principles, and in this talk today, we're just going to talk about 2 of them. The first is that the principle framework says that racializing the right to food means recognizing that hunger and its health impact is disproportionately experienced by communities of color. The United States has one of the highest rates of food insecurity in the industrialized world, between 11 to 15% over the last 2 decades. However, these averages hide an important story about inequities. Hunger is disproportionately experienced by women, parents, and communities of color. In this sense, hunger is a gender and racialized phenomenon. When we do research at the food shelf, we're often interviewing moms who are there with their kids, often who are victims of domestic abuse, living in shelters, coming to the food shelf, trying to get food to take care of their families. And in that interaction, you see that hunger isn't just about a box of cereal, it's about the trauma of domestic violence and the trauma of not having a place to live. Food insecurity among Latina and Black households is 20 to 25% of the population, and poverty is the biggest predictor of hunger. The food insecurity rate of people of color in every state is consistently at least 2 to 6 times higher than that of white. This doubled and even tripled during the COVID pandemic. Racializing the right to food means recognizing and acknowledging the disproportionate impacts of hunger on racialized communities. And also thinking about hunger as something which is experienced within bodies, and bodies are affected and shaped and traumatized by a lack of access to food. When you don't have enough food to eat, it leads to larger health problems. Obesity, weight gain, diabetes, heart disease, and mental health impacts like depression and anxiety. So many of the disciplines at this campus, like psychology, where people are thinking about going out into the community and working with people, hunger becomes an issue which isn't just about the food shelf, it's about the medical establishments, it's about the schools, it's about the workplaces that people interact in and how they're able to do so when they don't have enough food in their body. In Imperial County, more than 3/4 of adults report inadequate fruit and vegetable consumption, and 7 to 9% of adults who are over the age of 20 have been diagnosed with diabetes. So you see, even in a place with a rich agricultural tradition, lack of access to food. All of this speaks to the idea that food is a social determinant of health. This means recognizing that some communities face a disproportionate burden of hunger and food insecurity. What this means is that food is one of the factors, a non-medical factor that impacts health. So for instance, when people lack access to food, this is going to affect not just nutrition, but how they think about themselves, their self-esteem, their self-confidence, and carrying out healthy behaviors. So you see a lot of people at the food shelf smoking, and they're smoking because their life is so stressful, and now they're lined up in a line to get enough food to eat. And so rather than shaming them for smoking, we want to think about, hey, let's think about the food shelf providing you with the resources to get through your life, and let's support you with, I'm a housing person, a housing first model, but also a food first model to support people, and then worry about supporting them in other traumas that they're facing. And this basically means that all of the stress is going to show up in their lab work. It's going to show up in their blood and their body. Added to that, some people may also take up unhealthy behaviors to deal with that stress. So it's important to point out that these risk conditions, like lack of food, are not inevitable conditions. Rather, they are shaped by power, money, and resources. Now let's look at Principle 2. Principle 2 states that racializing the right to food means recognizing the historic role of white governments and governance played in producing hunger through their actions and inactions. Hunger is disproportionately experienced by people of color, but this is just half the story. And there's a great danger in telling just half the story because it leads to inaccuracies. For example, Native people didn't always wrestle with the problem of food insecurity, neither did African American, Latin, Hmong, or Pacific Islanders. In fact, each of these communities enjoyed food sovereignty at one time in their history, but over the last 500 years, they've had their knowledge, land, and labor stolen and exploited. The one thing these groups have in common is exposure to white supremacy and racist government. When we study history and governance, we begin to see that the United States, like other settler colonial empires, has consistently used its state power to uplift the needs of white citizens at the expense of communities of color. The state uses physical and psychological violence, like stigma, to discriminate against people of color, as well as policy. For students here who are studying public administration, Ta-Nehisi Coates uses the phrase that policy is elegant forms of racism. And those elegant forms of racism deny people the ability to feed themselves. We see this in agricultural policy, where native lands and African American farmers were stolen and acquired, where programs like the Bracero program systematically disempowered Latin farmers. These policies and practice created wealth in white communities and poverty in Black and Indigenous communities, what we refer to as BIPOC communities. With regard to urban planning, another one of my backgrounds, we see policies like redlining created residential segregation, food apartheid, food deserts, food swamps, and grocery gaps. These practices stripped capital from BIPOC housing and neighborhoods. When it comes to hunger nutritional policies, we see inadequate hunger programs that only serve to decrease health and life chances of communities of color. Rebecca will expand on these policies later, but something to point out here is that hunger is not only about food, but about economic and political empowerment. These policies have systematically disenfranchised African Americans. So here's an example of how public policy impacts food access. The Imperial County Health Status Report notes that 13 to 18 census tracts are food deserts, and approximately 78,000 people live in those communities. The question perhaps you've wondered is, why is it that a place with so much agriculture is experiencing hunger? Here's another example of public policy impacting food access. Again, the Imperial County Health Report notes that the grocery store rate is lower than the California average. And now Rebecca is going to talk a little bit more about hunger nutritional policy.
So, just as a brief disclaimer, Adam and I are not policy, but the way in which we think about policy as the way in which governments respond to problems, right? That's policy. How does the government respond to a social problem or an issue? It does so through policy. So the question we have is, how does the government solve hunger today? And we put solve in quotations over there because there's a sense among scholars and activists and people who do this work that the government does not really solve hunger or fix hunger. The thing that it does is that it manages hunger. And that's the term we see a lot being used, it manages hunger. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. So as I mentioned before, hunger insecurity impacts a gigantic number of people in the US, right? About 50 million people. And the government manages hunger through policy in two ways. It has two ways in which it addresses hunger. One, through government programs, and second, through charitable programs. Government programs include things like the SNAP program, which is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as the Food Stamps Program. WIC, which is Women in Insurance Program, and then the National School Lunch Program. So those are some of the government programs that are used to manage hunger. And then it also uses charitable programs like food pantries and soup kitchens to manage this problem. The USDA runs these government programs, or food assistance programs, and in 2018, and the numbers are still the same, it spent around $98 billion on federal food assistance, $98 billion. And I know that that sounds like a gigantic sum, but just to put it into perspective, the total sales in 2017 for Pepsi was $64 billion, right? So when you think about massive federal food assistance programs, food assistance is one of the largest programs the government has, and it's 98 billion compared to the 64 billion that Pepsi gets in sales. But here's what I really want to show you. Charitable food assistance programs, which is the second way in which the government sort of manages this hunger problem in the U.S., it only accounts for about 3 to 5 billion. So it's really a small fraction of those federal food assistance programs, just a tiny fraction. And yet, even though it's a small sum, food pantries are a cultural phenomenon. Almost everyone in the U.S. is engaged in the work of food pantries in some way. And here are some numbers of people who are involved in food banking today. Feeding America, I don't know if you're familiar with that organization, but it's sort of a big food bank hub, right? And it has about 200 food banks affiliated with it. And Feeding America will send food to these food banks, which then will distribute them to food pantries across the nation. And there are about 60,000 pantries across the nation, and that's just the ones we're counting, and not sort of the smaller ones are being counted in that. So you can imagine it's a lot more than that. So basically, you've got about 2/3 of the country involved directly or indirectly in the work of pantries. And this is where people come to meet their food needs, right? Because they're not getting enough federal food assistance to those government programs. So they're meeting the gap by using charitable food programs. But because of all of these numbers of people working in food pantries, this is why Jan Poppendieck, who's one of the first scholars to notice this problem, said fighting hunger in the U.S. is a national pastime. We don't solve hunger through this national pastime, we just manage the problem. And managing hunger today involves a whole lot of people, and a lot of those people feel really good about themselves, that they're doing something good in the world because they feel like they are helping solve the problem. But while food pantries may solve an individual's hunger, right, and meet their individual immediate need, it doesn't do anything to address all of that racist public policy that Adam talked about, that created hunger to begin with, that racial, colonial, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-communities of color policy. The hunger and nutrition policy today does little to intervene in racist agricultural or urban planning policies. And then what that charitable food system does sort of offers then a solution to a problem which has very deep roots. All right, so I talked about sort of, you've got these big, the federal food assistance programs, $98 billion. You've got the small little piece of that, 3 to 5 billion coming from charitable food pantries. And the question, I don't know if any of you had, if you've volunteered at food pantries, but where does all this food come from, right? Like, for instance, Melissa here, she does great work in the food pantry. Where is all of this free food coming from? And that's something that Adam and I and some other scholars call sort of almost got like a second tier of the food system, a shadow food system that's in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about where this food is coming from and some of that policy that leads to that as sort of that happening. So there are two major sources for this food that comes into the food bank. Extra food that comes from corporations, that's one kind of place where the food is coming from, and then government commodities, and that's the second place, right? So extra food from corporations and government commodities. And we call all of this industrial surplus food, right? And sometimes scholars refer to this as capitalist waste, right? It's wasted in the system, but it's actually not waste because it's valuable and it's sent somewhere else and it has value. So industrial surplus food that comes from corporations is food that corporations deem, the term they use, unsaleable, unable to sell that food on the regular market for whatever reason. And when we talk about these corporations, we talk about large agro-industrial corporations like Cargill, General Mills. We're talking about retailers like Walmart, Target, and they all may have these items that are close to their sell-by dates, or sometimes they got damaged because they fell off the truck during transportation, right? Or maybe they just want to move that product fast to the system because they've got another product coming on the line, another product, which is going to be a shinier product, and they want to sell that. So because of that, you've got all of this kind of waste food that they don't deem as valuable anymore. And that food then gets sent down the food banking line. And it goes to places like Feeding America, their big food hub, and then it's sent to different pantries across the country, right? So that's one way in which pantries and food banks get their food. That's that industrial surplus. It's extra. And of course, these corporations, why do they do it? They like to tell you, right, that they do it because they're really kind and generous to their communities, and it's seen as being socially responsible and all of those things. But what they don't tell you is that they also receive massive tax write-offs for donating this food. And they also, this is something we don't think about, they save on the dumping fees, right? So remember we talked about like how getting rid of that food waste is a part of the food system. This helps them in that sense because then they don't have to deal with this so-called trash food, right? And they get to save on the dumping fees because food banks are ready to take it and to do that work for them. There are also Good Samaritan laws in place that protect the whole food banking system, right? And these corporations, in case somebody falls sick from this food, right? So when these corporations donate food, they are basically free of any kind of legal ramifications that might happen because maybe bad food has come down the chain, and that's the Good Samaritan law. All right, so that's one source of food, sort of this industrial surplus that comes from corporations. Second, the other major source of food is government commodities. You may have heard that term, especially living in an agricultural sort of area, government commodities. So the government subsidizes big agriculture each year by backing the production of certain kinds of food. For example, beets. And we saw a lot of beets, for instance, in Minnesota where we were before. If there's a glut in the market because of the overproduction of certain crops, then to protect farmers and industries, the government buys food back to keep food prices stable. And what does it do with that food? That food the government has bought back from farmers, it sends it to food banks. So again, it's industrial surplus. It subsidizes all of this food now. It's got too much food. It needs to stabilize the agricultural economy, and so we'll buy back food. Consistent with what Adam sort of talked about, was being subsidized, mostly white farmers and big corporations who run these gigantic sort of farms, right? So the money is not trickling down to the workers who actually work the land, process the food, and all of those other stages in the food system. It's sort of disproportionately those subsidies go to white farms. So one important way then to think about food pantries in the food banking industry is that they help corporations get rid of surplus food. And they help the government stabilize markets of big agriculture. And this is also why it's very politically popular, food banking and food charity. Republicans like it because it helps corporations. Democrats love it because it helps poor people. But what we're finding in our research, and as Adam mentioned, our work over the last 10 years has been talking to people who use pantries. So go there on a regular basis, we talk to staff, we talk to volunteers. And what we're finding in our research is that people are very anxious about the food that they're eating and that they're getting from food pantries. They're worried about processed foods. They're worried about, not having access to fresh food, vegetables. They're worried that they live in food deserts, that they cannot afford the food they want to eat. Food safety, obesity, weight gain, and all of these things come up, right? So it's not like people are just saying, oh, we give you free food, we love it, like give it to us. On the one hand, they're saying, yes, we need it to make our food ends meet, but they also at the very same time really anxious about the food that they're eating, right? So now not only are they worried about hunger, but they are also worried about the impact that this food is having on their body. Next, Adam is going to talk about some new directions of policy imaginaries that we see as vital to addressing the problem of hunger and its root causes.
So doing work at the food shelf is often it's really difficult work because you're spending time there and there's big bags of pistachios and almonds and really expensive commodities that have been purchased through this government surplus that are now being given away. And then there's big crates full of like Moana themed yogurt. And after Moana has been in the theaters for a while, they've moved that to the food shelf and then brought in the Paw Patrol themed yogurt that they're giving out. And then there's all of these people that are lined up to get the food. And often in COVID, they're waiting outside in the cold or they're waiting outside in the rain and they're like really anxious and not having a good time. And then there's these volunteers that come every week to work at the food shelf and their friends are there and their friends from church and they love coming to the food shelf to volunteer. So all of these forces are interacting and often the people who are working at the food shelf are white. Often the people who are out waiting for the food are people of color, and you see all of these aspects of our food shelf coming together. At the same time, when people talk about wanting to fight hunger, they say they want to go to the food shelf and go to the food bank because that's where you fight hunger. And so this tension and really palpable tension led Rebecca and I to think about if you want to fight hunger, what could that look like? How could we use public policy to redress racism and to intercede, I don't think that's the word, and to affect how the food system is working. So in the paper, we talk about 6 different policy vistas. And we call them policy vistas to say they're not specific policies, but they're new ways to think about how these programs work that we think will be more effective at fighting hunger because they're build political power in communities and they're addressing the root causes of hunger. They're not just addressing the physical sensation of hunger. So the first one is repairing SNAP. The Supplemental Nutritional Access Program is the cornerstone of anti-hunger policy in the U.S. SNAP benefits can currently be used like cash, to buy fruits, vegetables, cereal, bread, milk, fish, and dairy products. While SNAP is one of the first lines of defense against hunger, it functions as a vestige of structural racism, evident in the low amount provided, as well as how these benefits are provided. The current average SNAP benefit is only $136, and every state, over 50% of the people who qualify for SNAP don't get SNAP because it's not enough money for them to go to the trouble of filling out the form, or the forms are so long and laborious that people don't fill them out because it's such a stigmatizing thing to do, which is terrible because this is the kind of a program that can put food right into people's bellies and can be spent at stores near them. There's also a lot of stigma and surveillance that surrounds SNAP, and this serves to oppress people as opposed to using public policy to make life better for people. We advocate reconstituting SNAP with a view towards racial reparations and restitution that gets rid of stigma. SNAP Plus, as we call it, should not be framed as a welfare program aimed at aiding and assisting Black and Brown families, but rather as a tool to make restitutions for ongoing legacies of racism. SNAP as a form of reparation. Our second policy vista is restoring food sovereignty. We argue that generations of USDA policy that pilfered agricultural land from BIPOC communities must be met with a similar investment to develop food growing and producing infrastructures in these communities. We can see that going on with programs to create gardens in your backyards that Melissa put on. We amplify the voices of BIPOC farmers and activists who assert the importance of returning land or the land back initiatives to Black and Brown communities. Our third policy vista is revitalizing grocery stores. We argued for a renewed commitment by the state to expand and support local grocery stores in urban neighborhoods. Creating public policy that rejuvenates BIPOC ownerships of grocery stores is necessary to close existing grocery gaps. Not only do grocery gaps deny communities of color access to healthy, high-quality food, but they also deny communities access to the core building blocks of communities' life. Supporting BIPOC and immigrant grocers and community food entrepreneurs is a way to make food available, accessible, and adequate in redline neighborhoods. Our fourth policy vista is reframing restaurants. In communities of color, particularly low-income Black and Brown communities, eating prepared foods outside of the home has particular significance in light of ongoing legacies of racism, where communities of color were restricted from having homes with kitchens and cooking spaces. More recently, COVID has also shown us the many weaknesses of the restaurant industry. One way to reimagine the restaurant business from a right-based perspective is to see them as purveyors of high-quality, affordable prepared foods that meet the everyday lives of people. Rather than only serving fancy food that only the middle class and elite can afford, restaurants should be refashioned into affordable restaurants, community cafeterias, and fast food canteens, where people of all incomes can access high-quality prepared food. Fifth, we argue for reconstituting food pantries. Rebeca and I have spent a lot of our lives in food pantries, and even though they're not always great institutions, they're so embedded in people's lives and so embedded in neighborhoods, embedded in campuses, that we see them as places that can serve an important role. Given the size and resiliency of the existing food banking system and its extensive reach into neighborhoods, the possibilities for food pantry transformation are tremendous. Food pantries can be spaces of survivance, where Black and Brown folk can build community and solidarity with each other alongside their white allies. Food pantries can serve as sites for securing structural rights like healthcare, childcare, voter registration, and government benefits enrollment. Building community cohesion through eating, cooking, and socializing. Building solidarity through storytelling, activism, and political agitation. And we can see this already in the great work that Melissa's doing at the shelf here, where it's actually part of campus life and part of building food sovereignty on this campus. Our sixth policy vista is rebuilding communication sovereignty. Communication sovereignty is conceptualized as a key resource for building infrastructures of listening to marginalized voices. We argue that one way to do this is to invest in communication infrastructure, which is necessary for racialized groups to tell their stories and forge new pathways for political activism. Scholars and activists of color point out the importance of storytelling for advocacy, building community, and bringing people back to their land. Their voices disrupt the sanitized narratives of hunger and American history and illuminate the strength, resilience, and survivance of racialized communities. And this goes hand in hand with building the ability to grow food and to have access to healthy food. And now Rebecca is going to briefly recap it.
Right, so we started off talking about the right to food and food justice. And one of the questions that asked, in the right to food slide was, who was responsible for securing the right to food? And according to the United Nations and Human Rights Charter, governments are responsible, right? Governments don't like to say that they're responsible, and they often don't want to be responsible, and they hand their work over to communities. And that's one of the reasons we have so much food banking going on. It's a way of shifting government responsibility to communities to say, this is your problem, you can take care of it, right? So our work has been to bring back the question of government into creating stronger social safety nets for people. We're doing the very basic jobs that government should do, which is to provide food, housing, water, and those basic needs, right? And so that's why we have these policy vistas where the government is again sort of foregrounded as playing a key role in facilitating access to food. And these six policy vistas that emerge, those policy vistas that emerge when we view hunger and food insecurity through a right to food and food justice lens. So repairing SNAP, restoring food sovereignty, revitalizing grocery stores, reframing restaurants, reconstituting pantries, and then rebuilding communication sovereignty. These policies are a way to intervene in the historical and ongoing racial and ethnic violence that has marginalized communities by removing their very basic human needs and right, the right to food. We are at a historic juncture with a lasting intersection of the forces of the pandemic, right-wing nationalism, and a failing neoliberal capitalism of speed, sort of state and government. This juncture offers opportunities to explore fundamental questions about food equity that puts the needs and interests of communities of color and marginalized communities at the center. And we believe that these creative policy vistas are necessary to, shake up the food system a little bit. We assert that these policy imaginaries offered here are just the beginning of what could be. And we encourage you as students, as activists, as policymakers, people in public affairs, to think outside the confines of the current food system and to imagine new futures. And with that, we'd like to thank you for your time and for being here today. And we're happy to take any comments and questions that you might have to have a conversation. Thank you.
There was a lot of fun by the government. We will see in the future any way they can approve any investment by the family that are able to buy prep meals.
Yeah, I think that was really one of our arguments, was that the way people live their lives now, you need to buy prepared food because people are working difficult hours, people don't have time to cook, people don't have kitchens to cook in. So changing that so that restaurants could accept SNAP benefits and restaurants can offer lower price prepared food seems like a really great alternative.
Also, do you see any possibility for, like we got our children going to school, they get 2 meals. They get breakfast and they get lunch. Do you see that happening for adults?
Yeah, I'm from Minnesota, and in Minnesota they don't cancel school unless it's like 40 below, because they know every time they cancel school, kids don't get a meal to eat, and so you just don't cancel school. And schools are educating people, but they're also this like frontline force. Rebecca gave some of the data that the National School Lunch Program and then the summer feeding sites are one of these cornerstone ways of creating of fighting hunger. And then EPT is the way that we try to stretch that out to cover all people, but it doesn't. But it, as Rebecca noted, it manages hunger. It doesn't solve hunger. It gives people just enough food to stay out of the street and go to work, but not enough food to actually eat the food they want to eat and to actually live a healthy and engaged lifestyle. And that's why, even though $89 billion spent on SNAP benefits, and you still have a 12 to 15% of the population experiencing food insecurity.
I think just to follow up on that, right? I mean, can adults also have access to food, right? Children get national school lunch programs, and what is there for adults? And you're right that there is a big sort of gaping hole. And I think it's interesting, during the pandemic, it was terrible. The pandemic was horrible, and we lost so many people because of it. But one of the things that food scholars started seeing was that some of the innovations that they were doing with regard to food and children, it was actually working quite well. So when schools shut down, the school buses, because it's already an infrastructure, I don't know if it happened here, we were in Minnesota, they would just be in the school parking lot and they would give out lunch to students. They weren't checking cards, they weren't checking where you're from, how many do you want, and they'll give you like 2 bags. And Adam and I, we're also eating that lunch because it was nice, it was good, we didn't have to cook. Yeah, it was ready. It was so quick, and we were like, hey, this is nice. I mean, and we'd be waiting for those, bags of lunch because it was just cooked and ready and you didn't have to work at it. But it's a great idea, right? I mean, it helps us work better, it fits with our lives, and so that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about when we need to shake up the food system. Like, we need to do something different because it's not meeting the needs of a gigantic proportion of our population.
Often you'll see, like if you go to low-income senior centers or community centers, you'll see that there's some food there. And that's that same food. Some of it goes to the food shelf, and then some of it gets distributed out to those other places. But one of the things that Rebecca and I always argue is that the industrial food system makes more than enough food for everyone. We should be giving it out with abundance, not with scarcity. Like, there's no reason to be saying, oh, only take one bag of this or one bag of that. Take all of it, because there's more of it coming. And if there's not more of it coming, we can get more of it to come. I mean, this is a very talented country. It can do all sorts. If you put a man on the moon, I mean, you could certainly get people enough food to eat. These are solvable problems. We're supposed to give out it. We're supposed to give something out to everyone who asks a question.
That's two.
I have a question. I'm interested. Oh, did someone? Oh, I'm interested in urban development and policy and all that. And that's one of the things that you can easily see here in the Valley, especially if you look at where the Raleigh campus is. That's considered more of the poverty area. The way you go into the more affluent area, that's where you have your Vons, your Walmart, your hospital, your nicer schools, etc. My question to you is, how do you see that change in urban development? Maybe what type of laws or ideas might be in place to really fight that food scarcity? Because the one thing that we as a campus has to take into consideration is the location on our campus and what is available there, which is Dunkin' Donuts, Wendy's, and that's it, I think. And so our students are going to go there, and we have to start taking that into account. That was a loaded question.
I mean, I think one thing to do is to think creatively about how do you provide people. So my dissertation was about Dominican-owned grocery stores, little bodegas in Philadelphia. And when you think about the foodscape of Philadelphia, everybody thinks about farmers markets and they think about grocery stores, and they never think about immigrant-owned grocery stores. And these were small grocery stores, and they often didn't have freezers and didn't have the ability to sell healthy food. And they were discriminated against because they were immigrants and because they were seen as profiting off the neighborhoods. And if you talk to them, they were charging high prices because they were buying stuff from the distributors for high prices. They couldn't afford coolers for fresh vegetables. So a bunch of organizations, a group called the Food Trust, started offering them access to refrigerators so they could have healthier food. And they were part of a whole process that changed the discourse that said, immigrants are part of our community. They're feeding people. Let's support them. And let's recognize those small stores as being part of our neighborhood. So I think one way to do it is to just think creatively about how you can do anti-racist activism through supporting small grocery stores and especially supporting immigrant-owned grocery stores. And also, there's a lot of people now opening up co-ops that aren't only serving healthy food, but are just saying, hey, if we all work together to offer food, we can offer it for a lower price through a different model than the traditional grocery stores. Grocery stores want to be really big in order to make money. And so anytime you have a small grocery store, you need to be thinking creatively about how to make those numbers work.
And I just want to add, this is something that Adam and I have talked about a lot about this particular campus. And especially, listening to Melissa, talking about the fact that there is no place to eat on campus, that just blows our mind that SDSU created a campus, but didn't put food in here, right? The right to food, it's a basic need. Like when you think about food, like if you put in a bathroom, you've got to have food. Like those things go together. Like, how can you have a campus without food? And so one of our initial things was, we just have to advocate, right? This is for somebody bigger to take responsibility for that. You are being asked to solve a problem, right, that you didn't create. But on the other hand, are they going to take responsibility, right? And if they're not, then what are those creative means by which it can happen? And again, if you have like a food shelf like the one Melissa is running with here, how can you use that in ways that go beyond just food pantry, right? Can you have people, entrepreneurs, private entrepreneurs, right? Creative entrepreneurs give you, sell you, right? Food at a discount, right? Ready, prepared food, which then students can come and pick up, on the go. Weirdly enough, we have the exact same problem at the main campus. I have students in my courses who cannot afford any of the food on campus. Everything, we've actually done a survey of like the cheapest food, like it is hard. I mean, they're actually trying to come up with food hacks, things you can get for $5, very difficult. Everything is between $10 and $17 for a meal, and nobody has that kind of money. And then they also talked about how they used to be a McDonald's on the main campus, and they took that out 5 years ago. And that was the only thing that students could afford, and now it's gone. So, it's sort of this tension, right? Maybe it's not great food, fast food, but when you also take that out, then there are no meals left that students can afford. So they are struggling there as well. And I think we have to advocate with, people in charge of running this multi-billion-dollar university to take some responsibility for food and the health of our students, and also work at the same time to figure out a solution. Not so it's delicate. Have to have some sort of supermarkets require a certain policy. Small, very restaurants. We have very restaurants with option for the people who can afford it, and they're not cheap there. Right? So this is a struggle. I welcome that. I love that community cafeterias. I understand that hotel here, but that they have cafeterias that doesn't happen. Our conversation from our about food country, I have I can spend it on my team. A lot of them sell their plasma for $30, right? That's a legal way to get money here. Online, just have to. You're a good student, inorganic journals, because that was for market should have that option. The teacher and the students when they ask food without there to be told. All right, but I looked at examples in New Mexico and Texas for a nonprofit that had put in the map, and they asked for a kitchen in a vendor permit. And then you can pick a small entrepreneur, small business, a Latina owned entrepreneur, sell your breads or sell your tamales. And it's not, but so many subsidized. I really that that's something person
access to it, but they hours or some other vendor. I took on a trickle down. You know, here, it's very, I'd say it's unreported. Maybe somewhere over in the trunk, just I pay attention to that because that's how. Trying to bring us fresh firms to. So we don't always talk about we're doing kinds of. Colleagues, I welcome you back. I welcome you to collaborate with us. Talk with us. So, it's not one person. Yeah. That's not. So even lunch breaks for staff are not those. A lot of things that people have up front. Which is a conference law. You go to those bars and they're like, whatever. That's great. Shame to find. Help me problem solve. Is that your response? They come to us, but they themselves. So all these that's such a
liability insurance of $100,000. So
even the local businesses that we have, we can't have them on campus because they don't have that insurance.
So could we do like a collective insurance for many vendors? A union?
$1,000.
I just wanted to comment again, and I know the dean had mentioned this already, in terms of something that we've been able to do to work around that is really just park the food trucks just outside. So if you remember the event that we had with IBROP, we had the taco truck, it was parked right outside the gates. Same thing what we've done with AS when we've had Pinkies here on the outside. Again, having that resource, I think that's something that we have been able to do, but we don't require because it's not on campus, and still have those vendors on our campus, but not technically on our campus. And that's something that we're currently working on in terms of bringing a food truck. And that's kind of tentatively the plan, is to just park it outside the gates and right there giving students our access to that. And that will help us to work around the required liability insurance.
Yeah, like with the food truck, just spread the word to our local vendors and let them know that we have students and faculty and staff who are interested in their business. Any more questions?
Soda is a problem. Why still is not allowing to purchase?
Allows you to buy soda. If I'm-
It goes through, because on one hand, it's nothing good about soda for our body. But on the other hand, there's also this idea that people should be allowed to choose, and we don't want to talk down to people about what they should and shouldn't drink. And, from that large perspective, like activists will say, well, let's give people more access to food, to all kinds of food, to good food, right? And then we can start to talk about removing access to soda. But we shouldn't take away soda access and also have nothing else for people. So we've got to fix food deserts, we've got to fix, food apartheid, we've got to fix grocery gaps, redlining, supermarket redlining, and all of those issues, which are the big root causes of all the health problems also that we see. And let's not just zero in on the soda. But yeah, it's a complex issue, and there's a lot of fighting around that.
So listen, do you have only healthy food at your pantry, or what do you do? No, not this was yeah. And this is, so at the food shop that we used to work at, they would get soda and they would get those little Hostess Twinkies. And I remember the guy who worked there would just throw it away. And he would just say, if you look at the people coming to get food, this is gonna kill them. I can't give it to them. But it's not like he was only giving away kale and organic lettuce, He was giving away other food. And it was a question that you have to help people the best that you can. And you just have to figure out what you're gonna do to get through. And it's why all this work is so hard to do, because you're always dealing with people. I mean, literally, I'm literally the people would leave the hospital and they were living in a tent. And so the hospital would drop them off the homeless shelter, and then they would come over and they would still have their stitches, from surgery. And they would be trying to get enough food at the food shelf to make it through the next day. And that's the level of, that's what 14 to 15% food insecurity means. It means that people are just at the end of their rope. And when you're at that place, you have to get through the day. And if they need a Twinkie at that time, you give them a Twinkie, right? Because they've got other things, they've got other problems to deal with. But we still pour the food out.
Vegetables for our students. Not anyone would do that.
My next question goes on that comment, but before that, I just want to say thank you to Melissa and thank you, Dr. Souza and Dr. Fine for a great presentation. I see so many connections to what we're facing here today in our campus, especially with your two points for your talk. One of them with the racializing the right to food and connecting it to white supremacy, and really how that is a reality that we're facing here. As you can see in our campus, we lack some of the most basic needs in any higher education institution, and we are lacking it here comparably to our West Campus or San Diego main campus, which is predominantly white. It does not face the same challenges, and we're a predominantly brown campus located at the border, less than a mile, and those are just parallels that I see to your presentation, and just thank you for pointing that out, because it's also happening here. But my question is building on Susanna's comment, and that is how can we support the food pantry? So the food pantry here at our campus is a very special space, not only because of the very important component of addressing the basic needs for our students, but also because it's a space of community. It's a space to come together. And even though it's in the back of the library, at least I can say for myself that I feel that it's the heart of our campus. So knowing how inclusive and welcoming of a space it is, but also understanding that it is, we are addressing some of the most basic needs that not just, in SEC Pure Valley, but for our greater campus one SEC community. How can we support our food pantry today? How can we encourage our campus leaders who are making these decisions and managing these millions, billions of, of our campus money to prioritize this very important space? And for things as simple as, for example, it's significantly ran by volunteers. Why not hire those volunteers as student assistants, and have an actual, a team that can go with Melissa to the fields and bring that fresh food, or things like having enough snacks, for students, day-to-day, things of that sort. So my question to you is, what advice would you give, whether it's our campus community or campus leaders, to support such an important space today?
So we wrote a proposal looking for more funding for Melissa's work, and we said it's not a food shelf, it's a food hub. It's the place where you can have the taco truck park outside, put the picnic benches there, hire students to work there so that they're getting paid, because volunteers need money, right? So they're less food insecure. There's a food shelf that I went to in South Minneapolis that is part of a larger group that serves people living with AIDS. And that food shelf served prepared food, because so many people on that cocktail of drugs needed rich, buttery food that they couldn't prepare. And so the food shelf had all of this food prepared and ready to go. And I thought, oh, I've never seen that before. That's what we need. And they didn't call the people at the food shelf clients, they called them members. Because they all had to be a member of that. And so they would help them to get the healthy food. But I love the idea that there's no reason why a food shelf can't have prepared food. There's no reason why you have to put the word shelf there. Call it a hub, or just call it Melissa's place. You know, just call it a convenience, like a shelf in Morocco calls the stop. And it's just called the stop. It's just a place that does food work. And they do food classes. It's in a really diverse neighborhood, so they have all sorts of different and cook together. So I think one idea is just to make this space that is so important to everyone, make that central to bringing in food trucks, make it central to creating a kitchen, and help us write grants, to pay for the students to do that kind of work. And in the presentation, we end with this idea of sovereignty, communication sovereignty, but there's no reason why Melissa's place can't also have poetry readings and art exhibitions and things like that. So I think sometimes we think about the food pantry and it's a little box like this, but there's no reason why that box can't be, so much bigger. I went to another food pantry. I love it. They were showing me this big distribution network they had with the cars coming through during COVID and all that stuff. And then we walked through and they had this beautiful code kitchen. And so you doing this work know how much a code kitchen costs. And this was in a really white suburb of Minneapolis, and they were renting out that code kitchen to Somali women who were making samosas there, and then they were selling them at local stores. And so they had taken this food pantry, which we had criticized in this talk, right? And they had turned it into a place that was supporting immigrant women entrepreneurs. And I was like, wow, I wish that was on your billboard, right? But instead, it's kind of a place that's often stigmatized. So I think finding some ways to think about it in a non-stigmatized way, in a way that says, this is Melissa's place, this is the heart of the campus, this is where we all come, because it's the only place on campus that has food for us, and that has a really great person that wants to, support our space.
Love Melissa's place is being much better. But we've always talked about it as an infrastructure of care, right? In a space and in spaces where people above us are not accountable and oftentimes so careless with our basic rights and basic needs. You have these huge infrastructures of care, right? Community care that sort of come up. And Melissa's place is like a great example of that infrastructure of care. It's so small and yet it has sort of this impact in the local sort of community among students. And that the person running it is going out of their way to make that a caring space. I think to sort of build on that, Adam and I are in and willing to collaborate, and we've been sort of, talking with Melissa, trying to apply for grants to sort of support her work. But I also think it sounds like one big thing that needs to happen is, and maybe it's already happened, but the conversation also to have with the STSU big way, right? The people making these decisions. Maybe we need to write a memo. Maybe we need to write a letter laying out what the problem is and putting some language on it, right? And calling out this discrepancy and this discrimination that is going on this campus, right, across the campuses. And there's no reason not to do it. And I think it needs to be addressed. And if they haven't heard it again, it will just be another time that they hear it. And we're happy to work with you on that. So at least we know they know, and there's not any sort of gaslighting about that. We know they know that there's a problem and a basic right. And there's no access to food here or limited access to food. And hey, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to support it? help them out, want to pick up to the back, waiting for the light. So he got dropped off really. I know a lot of concerns out. On local businesses trying to say, you know, just on products for students. But in terms of price point and affordability and out. Those are conversations that a vendor would have to agree. Force them to come. We want, but we're going to try to encourage them to listen to students or students that need back, but which type of vendor we prefer, that we should approach, that's we approach. How we're going to start finding the days and private that. When I come here and not how to make their own butter. You're not selling yourself plus and having like a business model and your time and one vendor. Yeah. How much is those? I don't know how much I can sell, but why don't you pilot it? I think their sales are, and so if it works out for you.
I'm sorry, there's someone on Zoom that's been waiting for their question forever, and I just feel really bad for them. Not sure if the presenters answered this already, but why do public schools K-12 serve processed mass-produced foods like canned foods that are warmed up and served and not serve freshly prepared healthy foods? This is from James B.
That goes back industrial surplus. So government commodities, basically what we see on coming to the school lunch program that the government is subsidizing big agriculture for in some way, right? Or government commodities, but it's excess food, and now they have to buy it back from these farmers. So mandarin oranges, for instance, from the can, those are kind of they've got an excess of it, the stabilized market, they buy it back from corporations like Dole, and then it comes down reboxed, right, or without any branding through the food banking system and also the National School Lunch Program. So that's why that food banking system, right, it sends, it's called TFAP food, right, which is government commodity food. It's coming, it's government commodities that are coming both to the food shelves and also going to National School Lunch Program, and also going to Meals on Wheels, for instance, and also going to other charitable sort of programs. So that's all that industrial surplus. So that's why it's there. I mean, the times you do see different kinds of food is because, the USDA has some special grants where, and some California school districts have it where they work with farmers to get, fresh foods into their schools. But those are special sort of USDA grant funded programs. But for the most part, it's industrial surplus food that's also going to schools to feed kids. That's part of policy. That's the policy.
Okay, we're down to our last two questions. So
thank you for being here. Guys, I have a question, and this is for everyone, especially for Melissa. I mean, because one of the problems, and I know right in the spot, right? One of the problems that I noticed is that I do teach back-to-back classes, and my students are hungry, not only students, faculty. And I thought, I don't know if this would be great that the food pantry, I mean, if we have the resources, would, and I don't know if we have a kitchen or not here. We don't. It would be good if we could have one kitchen and also like one day, like Monday, and students from, I don't know, from 11 to 4, that will be, students can buy it, and it's freshly made, I don't know, for $5, $4, guava de Jamaica. That's what they do at UABC. I'm getting them all at UABC because I have friends who go to UABC and they're eating better than I have. And they teach at UABC. And because we supone que nosotros somos los desarrollados, o sea, and so I'm like, we could do that. We just, well, I don't know, like have a little kitchen and have fresh products, like fresh food, like unos albóndigas, estoy tocando ahorita, unos enchiladas el jueves, no es en serio, o sea, Taco Tuesday, hey, you know what, yeah, de pavo, ¿no? Con lo que son, o sea, comida económica, they call it comida económica, which you have leftover beans, okay, well, no se preocupen el día siguiente. And I think that will be good as well. It's nutritious, it saves money, but it also, I don't know, like cooking classes. We can have cooking classes. I think, yeah, okay, have Melissa, and I'll be there, if she's not staying for coladas, sopa de lentejas. Pero I think this will also kind of like be better than eating that jack, to be honest. So that's just like a suggestion or question I have. But
Not a question, but more just a comment. And I want to apologize for being late, but I was in Zoom in my office. I'm going to go over there. It sounds like a party. So here I am. Again, thank you all for coming here today in terms of having these important discussions. But I also want to thank Melissa and Carla for their work in really kind of bringing you all here. This is actually supported through a student success fee grant. So a lot of work goes into that. And they've done an amazing job of expanding it beyond the box of the food pantry in terms of some of these discussions that we have, having this discussion here in terms of today, the cooking classes, connecting with the community. She's done an amazing job in terms of with that work and her team and her students, and just the fact, I mean, I love that they're not here today in terms of for this. So I just wanted to acknowledge them really quick. If we give them a hand, please. Thank you for your work. It's important. We really appreciate you all. And then I just wanted to maybe just kind of clarify some things in terms of our food pantry and the work that they have done. It's actually exceeded my expectations in terms of for the work that's happening in that space. And I don't know if you are all aware, but our food pantry is, I may hate to say it, but it's better than the food pantry in San Diego in regards to the resources that we have and have been allocated to here. I just checked the website just to make sure I wasn't up here telling stories, but they have very restricted hours and they're only open on certain days. And I'm sorry, it's outside. They don't even really have a permitted space. So in terms of having a commitment and an allocation to that space and what Melissa and her team have been able to do in terms of that has been absolutely amazing. I know a lot of times we operate from a mentality of scarcity, but in reality, I think we've been able to do some really good things with those resources, with the connections that Melissa's making out there in the community. And then again, just Melissa's been a champion in terms of for our students, what the needs are. So for example, maybe a couple months or maybe about a month ago, we were struggling with snacks. We were out of snacks. We were able to find some resources through a grant to now have a budget to keep those kinds of things going. And also the fact that SDSU has a little bit different model in terms of their food pantry. Here, San Diego State University doesn't even support their food pantry. San Diego State University supports our food pantry because San Diego State University's food pantry is the AS food pantry. So that's an initiative from AS. They have the food pantry, they have the food drive, and that's how they get their resources. So it's a little bit different, but we've been able to get great resources from San Diego State in terms of through the basic needs support, and that's what really has been able to fund our program. This is a new position. We've been able to fund that. We've been able to allocate the space. So I do want to recognize that and the great work that has been done by our by the folks over at Melissa's place. I like that. That's going to start to sound like a thing, but again, more just a comment. But I do have a question, and my question is this: here on our campus, one of our challenges in the beginning, and I think we've been able to make some great progress with that, is students just feeling comfortable going into the food pantry. But I'll tell you something about our population. Our students, a lot of our students, they need it. We know they need it. We know the numbers in terms of our students who receive any kind of financial aid, way higher than it is in San Diego. So there is that need here, but a lot of our students oftentimes, it's either a little bit embarrassed, or the other narrative that's out there is that, oh no, that's for somebody that really needs it. And I've heard that time and time again, no, I don't want to take that food because there's somebody that really needs it. I'm sorry, that food is for you. How do we kind of work to break that down so that all of our students, I think last time we checked, anywhere from 68 to 78% of our students are Pell eligible, which means they need it. How do we break down some of those barriers to continue the efforts that Melissa and her team have already started in regards to having our students feel more comfortable coming into that space?
Lots of small things to do, right? And one of those things is also just in the naming, when I'm not calling it a food tent, calling it that immediately changes sort of the environment in which that food is sort of being offered. I think not having any restrictions about who can get food from there, not having students fill out any paperwork or sign anything, right? Just keeping it sort of very welcoming and open. Those are just a few ways, right? And then I think also just, something I find really works is also informing students about what hunger is and how it sort of manifests in the US, right? I mean, it's 50 million people is a lot of people who are hungry, food insecure, right? And that food insecurity sometimes is extreme, right? People actually feeling hunger pangs, but a lot of it is actually just anxiety about not knowing where the next meal is coming from, right? And it's food anxiety, and it's not having enough food. It's not having enough of the right foods, and that's the way in which it sort of plays out in the U.S. And I think just sort of letting students know that this is a thing that a lot of people face. This is destigmatizing it in that way, saying that this is industrial surplus. You're actually helping the food system the way it's currently set up. When you take food from the food pantry, you're helping the food system because it's actually being able then to sort of status quo, right? It can keep sort of moving food down the food chain. And frankly, if you didn't take that food, it would probably be dumped. And that's more environmental damage, frankly. So if you need the food, like you should take it. And so I think also just educate students on the food and where it's coming from and how it gets used, and that there's enough food for everybody. It's the same thing that we also tell folks who are hesitant to sign up for SNAP benefits. It's there for you. That's what it's there for. You should use it. It's the right to food, and it's the smallest thing that the government is doing to help secure that right. You should take advantage of it.
That reflect, I think it's about creating a narrative about supporting people and moving away from that stigma and moving away from that fear.
Thank you, Adam and Rebecca, and for being here and teaching us about this important topic that needs to be addressed effectively. And thank you all for coming. I hope you have learned something new today and enjoyed your day. Thank you for giving me here.